a neutral Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to join NATO. And if Ukraine is to exist at all, it will have to be neutral. Eventually, people in Warsaw, the Russian military is very different today from what it was in Eisenhower's time. And the Russians have no aspirations to attack anybody in the West. They want to do business with everybody in the West.
Right. Well, why would Kiev even bring something this dangerous and suicidal into the military theater?
There's an easy answer to that question. It's called desperation. They're desperate. I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of people have they lost? We're now seeing people finally admit publicly in a series of publications, well, we've had at least 300,000 Ukrainian dead in terms of soldiers. I think it's much higher now. I think it's probably closer to 350,000. I don't know how many thousands of civilians have ended up being collateral damage as a result of these Russian strikes. The Russians have tried to avoid that. They have not deliberately killed civilians. That's a lot of nonsense. But the point is, a war is a war. And if you're going to destroy a Patriot missile battery in the vicinity of Kiev, which is effectively what has just happened, you're going to end up killing some people that are nearby. They're civilians. You're obviously going to kill contractors. I'm sure we probably lost some people who were there under contract.
Some of your former colleagues, maybe they're your friends, they're people I know and respect by reputation. A few of them have been on this show. Recently signed a letter which was published in the New York Times that referred to President Biden's "we're with you as long as it takes" as ill-defined, unachievable, and leading to an unmitigated disaster. Were you surprised to see these former military people say this, and will it have any effect?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no. It's not going to make any difference to the Biden administration. They're going to continue doing whatever they're doing. They're never going to admit that they made a terrible mistake. And yes, they have no strategy. Their strategy was, quote unquote, to harm Russia, and they're willing to destroy the Ukrainian nation in order to achieve that objective. Well, objective number one, harm Russia, hasn't worked. The sanctions are an abysmal failure. The Russian military is now larger, stronger, and more capable than it's ever been. The only people with a strategy are sitting in the Kremlin, and their strategy is very clear. We will have a neutral Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to join NATO. And if Ukraine is to exist at all, it will have to be neutral. Eventually, people in Warsaw, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, the people that border this place, they're all going to say, it's time to stop. The Russians are winning. They're going to get what they want.
Do you think the West, Western Europe, and the more sensible people in the Biden administration are getting tired of the war?
There's no one sensible at the national level in places like Berlin, Paris, London. Forget it. They've lost their minds. The same thing is true, sadly, in Helsinki, Stockholm, Oslo. They're out of touch with reality. The populations are different. The Germans have had it with this ridiculous war. They don't want any part of it. They don't want to send any soldiers over there. They're not sure they want to send any equipment. I think if you'd have put it in a referendum in Germany to begin with, and people had been allowed to tell the truth, I don't think a single German tank would have ever reached Russia. I mean, imagine sending tanks with the German Iron Cross painted on the side into Russia at this point. It's insane. Right. The Germans know that. They don't want anything to do with that. The Poles were the outliers, and here's the good news. The Polish population is turning against this whole thing. They're overwhelmed with millions of Ukrainian refugees. They talk about being Ukrainianized. You know, this is not going down well. I think the populations, if they get their way, will stop it.
The folks who published that letter that I just mentioned and about which you've just commented also published two maps, one an actual map and one a hypothetical. Here's the actual map of Europe showing all the U.S. and NATO military bases from Great Britain all the way down to Turkey and everywhere in between, all aimed at Moscow.
Of course.
Obviously, the Russians know this. You even see it in northern Africa. I mean, with the exception of France and Spain and Portugal, it's everywhere. It doesn't even show Poland, but we know that there's missiles there as well.
Well, it shows Poland, and there are Aegis missiles.
It's my old eyes. I'm sorry. It doesn't show Belarus. Okay, got it.
But I mean, if you look at Ukraine right now and you understand that the eastern end of Ukraine was to be the site of new missiles and new forces from NATO, it becomes entirely understandable why the Russians said enough is enough.
Right.
And why Belarus and Russia are now united in resisting the NATOization, if you will, of Ukraine. I mean, it's obvious. It's all aimed at Russia. By the way, just from an historical vantage point, it might be interesting for your viewers to know that when Eisenhower looked at the same map that we're viewing right now, his argument was we need to limit our commitment of capability, in other words, ground forces and missiles and so forth, to Norway and North Africa. Because at that point in time, when Europe was divided, he said the Soviets will overrun everything because we can't possibly stop millions of Soviet troops. Well, that's changed now. They're gone. The Russian military is very different today from what it was in Eisenhower's time. And the Russians have no aspirations to attack anybody in the West. They want to do business with everybody in the West.
Right.
Is that they want to.
Here's the hypothetical map of what the same proximity and number of missiles would look like if surrounding the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Cuba.
No, that's true.
The only problem with the Canadian one is the missiles are in the wrong direction. They're not aimed at Detroit or Chicago or New York or DC. But you can get the point. How would we react? Would start World War III if the Russians had missiles or the Chinese had missiles like that?
Well, of course, what we don't bother telling people is if you look in the Pacific and in the Atlantic off the coast of the United States, there are large numbers of submarines. The Russian submarines now can compensate for the absence of Russian missile forces or ground forces in either Canada or Mexico. We don't seem to understand how vulnerable we are. This is back to the problem of, what if we used a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon? Well, you've got submarines sitting in the Atlantic right now and the Pacific that'll simply push a button and the missiles will fly. Everything has changed. Warfare has changed. The whole idea of garrisoning people's countries on the periphery of another country, it's anachronistic thinking. They're sitting ducks in the future.
Before we sign off, the time with you goes by so fast. There's so much information for which my viewers and I are deeply grateful. I want to talk a little bit about this character, Prigozhin. By the way, before we analyze Prigozhin, do you know what the reference is to redwood cabinets? Is that maybe a dacha on the Black Sea?
Well, certainly dacha-like. Whether it's on the Black Sea or not, I don't know.
Okay.
So we need to understand something about Russians. For instance, Russians can be very vulgar. I mean, when they get angry and they swear and so forth, as opposed to, let's say, Germans. Almost never. It's like an enraged Italian in Palermo. They'll let you have it with both barrels. But, that's not going to happen to you probably up in Trieste. It's not going to happen. Different ways of doing business. So the Russian population listening to this eats this up. In other words, this is almost a good campaign speech if Mr. Prigozhin thinks he's going to be a future candidate for office, and who knows?
What does the defense minister and the Russian chief of staff, mentioned by name in very bitter tones, what do they think of it, or don't they care?
Well, General Gerasimov is a very intelligent and professional thinker and soldier, and he's going to look at this and say, well, what do you expect from Prigozhin? He's not a professional soldier. He's not part of our profession. He is a political military figure with ambitions. Gerasimov is not. He's at the top of the paradigm. He's trying to manage the entire theater and all the assets involved. It's useful to point out that General Surovikin, who is someone that large numbers of people in Russia admire for his professional knowledge, understanding, and conduct of the operation, He's the one who's been launching these strikes with great effectiveness. He's being told, manage Prigozhin's ammunition requirements. Fix it. And I think that's happened.